Hi, Supervisor. Yes, we can hear you.
All right, great. Thank you.
We still have a couple of minutes. I'll start the housekeeping comments at 11:30. Is that okay, or do you want me to go ahead and start them now?
What time is it now?
11:28?
Yeah, start them now.
Very good.
Thank you for participating in today's meeting. If attending in person, please do not connect to Zoom or teleconference while in the room, and please silence all devices. If translation is provided, click on the globe at the bottom of your screen to select either English or Spanish. Public comment will be taken after each item. If you're in the auditorium and wish to comment, please use the iPads located in the lobby or complete a blue speaker card as available. If you need assistance, please find a South Coast AQMD employee. Speakers may be limited to a total of 3 minutes or less for all agenda items. Times may be shortened to ensure all speakers can be heard. A countdown timer will be displayed on the screen for each public comment. More time will be allotted for Spanish translation that is not simultaneous. For questions or issues on making a public comment, please call the public advisor at 909-396-3247. That's 909-396-3247. Please adhere to the speaker time limit and treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being removed from the meeting. Be aware that this meeting is being recorded. By participating, you authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD.
Gracias por participar en la reunión de hoy. Si asiste en persona, favor de no conectarse a la conferencia telefónica o Zoom mientras esté en el auditorio y silencie sus dispositivos. Si traducción es disponible, haga clic en el icono de globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla para seleccionar inglés o español. Se tomarán comentarios del público después de cada punto. Si se encuentra en el auditorio y desea dar comentario, utilice los iPads ubicados en el vestíbulo o complete una tarjeta azul según esté disponible. Si necesita ayuda, localice a un empleado de South Coast AQMD. Los comentarios pueden ser limitados a un total de 3 minutos o menos para todos los puntos de la agenda. El tiempo límite puede ser reducido para que todos los comentarios puedan ser escuchados. Se mostrará un temporizador de cuenta regresiva en la pantalla para cada comentario público. Se asignará más tiempo para traducción al español si no es simultáneo. Si tiene preguntas o problemas sobre cómo hacer un comentario público, llame al asesor público al 909-396-3247. 909-396-3247. Respete el tiempo límite y favor de tratar a los demás con cortesía, civilidad y respeto. De lo contrario, es posible que se silencie el micrófono o que sea retirado de la reunión. Tenga en cuenta que esta reunión está siendo grabada. Al participar, usted autoriza la grabación de audio y contenido visual presentado durante el evento en vivo y da su consentimiento para el uso de la grabación en el dominio público por parte de South Coast AQMD.
We can go ahead and begin at your pleasure, Supervisor.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. It's 11:31, 11:32 now, as to my understanding. And why don't we go ahead and start with roll call. Let me see, hang tight. Well, I'll call a meeting to order, and then let's go ahead and start with roll call.
Good morning. Councilmember Cacciati,
Here.
Supervisor Hagman, absent.
I'm
Board
on
member-
but remote. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Supervisor Hagman isn't at a noticed location and can only participate as a,
No, he'll be in person. Wagner is.
oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was Hagman.
It is Hagman. He's just
It
not
is.
there.
It was Hagman. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Supervisor Hagman
Is okay.
is an observer. Thank you.
Board member Padilla Campos,
She's running late.
Supervisor Wagner, absent. And Chair Perez?
Here.
Thank you.
So Supervisor Wagner shows that he's on as a panelist, but perhaps he's not present. Supervisor Wagner, could you confirm? We'll go with he's absent.
Okay.
We do not have a quorum.
So we do not have a quorum. But the items are not action items, Supervisor Perez, so you can proceed if you wish to.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, because of the fact that we don't have any action items, we will proceed. And these are informational. But nonetheless, though, very important items for us to discuss as we move forward. This meeting is scheduled for a few hours, but I'm kind of the individual that likes to say less is more, and we get straight to it. My goal today is to start now, obviously, and end by 1 o'clock. At most 1:30 if need be, but I think that by 1 o'clock we should be fine. And before we get into the discussion topic at hand, let me ask if we have two information items. One is discussion of climate change committee charter, in which we will discuss concepts for draft climate change committee charter itself, and then an overview of the COP 29, the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is an annual meeting of member states to make key decisions regarding the implementation of the convention. This presentation will provide an overview of key decisions made at the recent COP meeting in Baku, Azerbaijan. I'm not sure if I said that correctly, but that's my attempt. And then obviously other business and public comment period. And so I'd like to just maybe ask Mr. Casciotti if he has any thoughts that you'd like to open up with before I open up with my comments.
Thank you, Supervisor. No, I'll defer to you, but I am excited about this, and just, again, whatever direction we take or framework we have, I just look forward, as I have indicated in other meetings, really working with this in our faith communities. We really need a lot of direction and instruction, especially after their leaders have come out supporting efforts to do something about climate change. And I think whether the pastors, priests, whatever the leaders are at the bottom, don't really understand how to take action. So I think this is an opportunity for us to be great leaders, and for you, Supervisor, to lead us in that effort as we really bring the public along, because with so many issues affecting people, inflation, we just had our Investment Oversight Committee meeting today, inflation, the economy on people's minds, that they sometimes forget these really existential issues which you're really spearheading. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for your points. Is there anyone else online that is now at the location that they need to be in? Okay, seeing or hearing none. As I stated before, climate change and greenhouse gas emissions do not stop at boundaries, at international boundaries. And I think that's why it's critical that our work in this committee be in partnership with local, state, federal agencies, as well as even internationally speaking. And what I mean by that is because we're so close to the border, Mexico and Latin America as a whole. And I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but I do believe that there are sister cities that come together to talk about relations, whatever that may be. I have that with the county and with different jurisdictions at the state and city level in Mexico. And they don't have a structure out there in Mexico like a county structure, for example. But I assume that there would be some type of air resource boards out in different parts of Mexico that potentially we can collaborate with. And that is a topic of discussion that I like to focus on when we talk about our scope of work. Now, I also understand that we're coming together today to try to think through action planning, tracking progress, obviously goal setting. And then with that being said, I like to think about, because of the fact that, we are limited in our authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, which is understood. I think it's important that we think about in our scope of work, what are the gaps that potentially we can fill that do not fall in another's jurisdiction or where we are not following the regulation, so that we can make sure that we are obviously abiding by the law and still progressing where we need to. So would international relations play a role in that? I'm not sure. Something for us to discuss. The faith community, and thinking about what Mr. Casciotti said and how we play a larger role with those individuals and that partnership. The business community, and thinking about every single time we're talking about any type of regulation that comes from AQMD or change or idea or rule or what have you, that there is also a cost benefit analysis associated to that. And how is that impacting people, as well as comparing that with how is that impacting the environment? I think that is also key. A lot of times we hear from folks that state that we're not ready yet. We'd like to get there. We like to move in this direction or that direction when we talk about rules, but the technology is not available. So how do we work with our technology committee, strengthen it, if you will, so that there can be an emphasis in technology and innovation and efforts to improve that sector, so that eventually we will get to that place where individuals, businesses will say that, now that the technology is available at a cheaper cost per se, maybe one day, then we could go ahead, obviously, and use those to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, out here, for example, another concept potentially in which I don't think we would be going against the regulations or not abiding by the law is in the issue of suspended particulate air, I guess it's called, the dust storms that we have out here in the Coachella Valley, and that being a form of air pollution per se. When people think about breathing air, clean air as a whole, they think of AQMD. They don't think of anybody else. And so potentially that would be a role for us. And that has maybe nothing to do with greenhouse gas emissions per se, but it has to deal with ensuring that people are breathing clean air at the end of the day, so that we can decrease, if you will, or ameliorate respiratory illnesses as a result of dust particles that are suspended in the air. So those are just some ideas that I just want to throw out there as we're going to be discussing, obviously, our objectives, the scope of work, meetings and communication. Obviously, all this needs to somehow get funded, resources and budget, that is. And how do we measure this? And what are the metrics? in evaluating and reporting for success in order for us to demonstrate that we are leading the charge on this effort as well as AQMD, and so that we can win over and gain the trust of the community and win over the entities that provide the funding streams moving forward. And there's a level of accountability. So at this point, I'll leave it at that, and like to hear from staff as to item number 1, discussion on climate change committee charter.
Thank you, Chair Perez. I'll be leading the discussion with regards to the Climate Change Committee Charter. And I appreciate the opening comments that you and Vice Chair Cacchiotti made with regards to direction of where this committee should go and be looking at and considering. So if we can bring up the slides. If we go to the next slide, please. So here we're talking about what is the committee doing, and perhaps the committee should establish a charter. This was something, Supervisor Perez, that you had asked about last time. And so what we wanted to do was to identify sort of the elements of a charter and sort of the process that we would go through. And I think we need to do this in the context of what you just said in terms of where is it that we would be going. And I think that there are a lot of ideas that come to mind based on what you said. You know, with regards to the regulatory authority that we do not have, when we look at that with the regulatory authority that we do have, we know that there is a relationship between greenhouse gases and criteria pollutants. And as you know, the discussion when it comes to air pollution has really been pushed to the wayside, and everything has really been more or less focused on climate. And when we look at what the administration, the Biden administration did, they provided a tremendous investment in dollars with regards to how can we address the climate. And when we look at what the National Climate Assessment studies have reported, that as climate change becomes more challenging, attaining our air quality standards will becoming more challenging. So when we bring all this back to what the charter of this climate change committee could do, in terms of the mission statement, I think that's something that we want to come back to, but we want to get agreement, Supervisor, that the mission statement has to reflect the reality. And the reality is that air quality and climate are inextricably linked together, and that we can in fact address both within our authority when we're addressing air quality. We're doing it right now when we are looking at zero emission standards. And so we want to clarify through a mission statement what that entails for the committee. And as you just said, Supervisor, establishing the goals, the structure, the process, the role of you as chair, and how in fact we would do reporting of the committee. We can go to the next slide, please. So we've actually talked about this earlier in our previous committee, as well as what you just noted in your opening comments. We do have limitations that were placed on air districts, and that was done as part of the AB 617 negotiations. So we recognize that there are limitations on ability to regulate. But what I think you noticed, Supervisor, is that we do have the ability to partner. We do have the ability to look at the opportunities that way. And I think that's what the charter would do that we talked about earlier. So if we go to the next slide. So the mission statement, I think, is ultimately we want to get to. And we have some suggestions here in terms of what is the mission of the Climate Change Committee, and that is to educate and advise the South Coast AQMD Board on climate change issues. I think, Supervisor, just given what you said, we probably need to expand that mission statement somewhat. I recognize that we want to keep the mission statement brief and very much to the point. But I think that we can recognize the role of air quality and climate together, and that there's opportunities for us to address both, even though we may lack the regulatory authority. But clearly, the issue has to focus on education and example. So if we go to the next slide, please. So on the next slide, what we can see is that part of what we want to do is to develop the goals. You had identified the goals. One of the things that I think that have been discussed earlier, for instance, was the development of a conference. Utilize the stature of the AQMD on air quality issues to try to have, in essence, our own convening, if you will. And I think part of the challenge that we want to be able to define there is who are the key partners? Who are the people that we can work with that highlight and face some of the same challenges that we have? And as the supervisor said, we are not the only metropolitan area that's facing air quality challenges. There are areas around the globe that face air quality challenges, whether it's London, whether it's Paris, whether you're in India, whether you're in China. They all face air quality challenges. And so here's an opportunity to look at what are some of the goals and how do we work with some of those other areas, if in fact that is something that we want to do. But at this point, what we're trying to do is just identify what those opportunities may be and what are the general frameworks and the guidance that we want to establish so that we do that work. Because again, as has been noted, depending on what stage we are, really impacts the budget. An international stage working requires a lot more funding, and that's something that we need to look at. How can we do that? And I think that with regards to developing the annual goals, again, when we're looking at establishing mechanisms that improve air quality, one of the key things that we always talk about, and that you noted, Supervisor, is technology. And I like to think that when it comes to technology, we're second to none as far as our expertise on moving towards zero emission technology. So we're going to continue to do that. And I think, again, that what we're trying to accomplish in this slide is just to talk about the fact that we can establish those annual goals. What we need to do is bring back a draft for the committee's consideration. And in the interim, work with the individual committee members to get their input so that we have those goals and that they can reflect what we bring back to staff. And then ultimately, we got to make sure that we're doing everything within our authority, within any limitations that we may face. And so that's obviously working very closely with our council and our staff on that. If we go to the next slide, please. We've talked about meeting on a quarterly basis. At this point, I would suggest that we maintain that quarterly basis. If we try to increase it right now, given all of the things that we're working on, it would be very difficult. And so I really would appreciate if we maintain the schedule on a quarterly basis. And I think that's why these quarterly meetings are so important. It gives us the opportunity to take your direction, input, and for us to be able to come back at the next meeting addressing the things that we're talking about. It goes without saying that, we will provide the material as much in advance as possible. We have a standing goal to make sure that that's at least a week in advance. And I think that if we are going to look at some of the international aspects, maybe we consider looking at some of the meetings in other locations and venues. But the primary spot that we want to do that is here at the district headquarters. Go to the next slide. As far as the meeting structure, I think the meeting structure that we've been utilizing works fine. Obviously, the chair, this is our third meeting of the Climate Change Committee this year. So we would continue on unless you have some direct thoughts or consideration. But I certainly think that bringing in additional speakers, outside experts is always helpful. And then bringing in other parties that are experiencing some of the same challenges that we are. And in fact, even other agencies that we might be able to partner with, sort of share their thoughts in terms of how we might be able to do that. And, some of the examples of that are much of the efforts that we're doing on building decarb directly aligns with what the CEC is doing. So maybe we can have the CEC talk with us or have some type of a joint meeting or listen to some of their staff on some of the things that they're doing and how they align with us. So these are some of the ideas and thoughts that we have with regards to future meetings and content. If we go to the next slide, please. Here again, I think that what we have is hopefully working. This pretty much follows the same format and outline that we utilize as we continue to move forward on all our other committees. So I want to go to the next slide, please. So we want to work on the draft charter for the committee's consideration and work with each of the individual committee members so that we can come back, as I said earlier, with the input of the committee members and provide the draft charter at the next committee meeting. So that really concludes my comments and really happy to answer any questions you all may have.
Okay. Is there anyone else on the line that wasn't on earlier?
I don't know if Supervisor Wagner is in his location.
Okay.
Hi, this is Patricia with Supervisor Wagner's office. He's having trouble getting in to the audio part through the telephone, and he's on his phone right now. We have it set up here, but it's through his computer. The telephone, when you dial through the telephone, it tells you that it's telling us that the meeting hasn't started. And with him, it's just letting him in as a guest and not as a participant.
Is the supervisor at the location that's been notified?
Yes.
So are you using the facility's microphone or?
I'm using the computer. He'll be here in a few minutes.
Okay, so he's not there yet.
Right.
He's trying to do it on the phone.
No, I know, but he's not at the specific location, in other words. So as soon as he gets to that specific location, then I figured I guess we'll be able to get him on.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else? How about Mr. Caccioli? Any thoughts?
Yes, Supervisor, just quickly on the presentation by staff. If you can pull up the slide deck, I think the fourth slide, possible climate change committee mission statement. That one.
Yep.
And there it is. Back.
There you go.
Back.
That
They're right there. The mission of I think it's a 1, 2, 3. The mission of the climate change to educate and advise the South Coast AQMD on climate change board. I would just, after Manny's comments and mine, Manny talked about, basically all our stakeholders again, whether it's the business community, supervisor mentioned, other governmental entities, local, regional, state, federal. And I really put a heavy emphasis on the faith communities, just because after the Pope's come out twice now on climate change, supervisor. And if we ever did have a conference, I would hope we'd invite somebody of his stature to come and maybe kick it off. Not that he would, but he travels a lot. His old age still gets around. This would be a great time for him to come to the Americas again and maybe kick off something of this nature, because I brought this up, Manny, in my movings into faith communities, and there's just a lot of, I'll give you an example. I was speaking to a person who teaches even at the seminary not long ago, and just the people coming through, all, whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever you are, they're taught about their theology, their religion, their faith, but they just don't understand what to do. They don't understand the connection between climate, pollution, health, and it's impacting the message of their whole basis of their faith. So I just see, when I talk to some people in those communities, Manny, they're uneducated, don't know what to do, unaware, and we have the resources and with your leadership in this committee, we can really bring about a dramatic change. Because I see, as the Pope came down with these directives and encouraging people to do something about it, and even said in his most recent papal declaration that I brought this up 5 years ago, and you guys have done nothing. You just, because the people at the bottom don't know what to do. So that's why I just would encourage us to just educate everybody. Thank you.
Okay. And so, just from my end, I know that I listed quite a bit of items, but we got to start somewhere. And we have to start with potentially what we can attempt to tackle sooner than later, and then move out towards potentially even some sort of international relation, if you will, or a larger perspective of an issue that includes the EPA or other federal level type of entities. But I definitely want to make sure, though, that in our conversations, and we've had these already in the past, is that maybe we open up our meetings with a presentation that gets the mind going. A presentation potentially on the 2 or 3 subjects that we are trying to focus on. You know, in the past, for example, we had a presentation, I believe, from I think it was from UC Riverside on the issue of, I want to say, the Sound Sea, air quality. I'm not exactly sure the gist of it all entirely, but because I forgot elements of it, but something that would allow us to start thinking through using theory so that we can move towards action. Or, for that matter, an economist that stems from a university or some sort of organization out there that is looking at climate change and looking at the impacts of climate change on the environment on one front, but on business community on the other, and how, for example, jobs are shifting. And what does that mean for workforce? And what does that mean for, entities that have existed before climate change did? And what's going to happen to those entities? Or another example, potentially a presentation on technology. Once again, some technologies exist, but folks keep saying that we're still lacking technology, and that's the reason why it's difficult and costly. What's out there right now, and what potentially will be coming. So that's going to require a little bit of a lit review, if you will, that would try to identify these different individuals, universities, experts, economists, what have you, that can really provide us an education to us as we educate the community as to what is the role of the Climate Change Committee and the role of AQMD moving forward through this committee. So those are just some of my thoughts after your presentation, Wayne, and I see as well Supervisor Don Wagner on board here. Supervisor, do you happen to have any, I'm not sure how much you've heard, but you're welcome to say anything you'd like to say as far as opening comments, or maybe a couple points you want to make as far as this committee is concerned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is the first of these committees that I've had the opportunity to participate in since joining the board. I am apologetic. I missed most of what came already because of a prior commitment. I am interested in hearing as we go forward. And I will echo one of the things I did hear as I was juggling calls was your comment about how climate change knows no jurisdictional boundaries. It doesn't start or stop at the jurisdictional boundaries of our agency. And so this is a problem that is an issue much greater than any of us. All of our solutions ought to take that into great consideration and make sure we are not unnecessarily disadvantaging ourselves at a time when the problem is shared by so many others and the solutions must be shared by so many others. So I thought that was a wise comment on your part, and I appreciate it. With that, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Supervisor Wagner. Is there anybody else online or present other than yourself, Mr. Casciotti there?
I don't see anybody else here, Manny.
Okay. Wayne, any thoughts from our comments that we just made?
Supervisor, I have just been informed that Board Member Padilla Campos is on. I don't know if she's.
Hi, wait, I am listening, but I didn't agendize my location, so I'm not officially on.
Okay.
I hope that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. You can listen in to your heart content. Thank you.
I think it would be helpful for yourself, Board Member Padilla Campos, as well as Board Member Hagman and anyone else that might be listening that's part of this committee. If you're willing to just jot down your ideas, your thoughts, and obviously we could provide those to staff. We can read through them ourselves so that we could obviously try to respond to those points that I'm sure are very important. And so I just want to make sure I'm clear on that front as well. And so, I'm not exactly sure how much we got to spend time on this part of the agenda here. Wayne?
Supervisor, if I may suggest that we reach out to each of the committee members individually and then take that. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time today other than giving us direction. And I think you've been pretty good and the other comments that we've heard from the Vice Chair and Supervisor Wagner in terms of things that you're looking for the charter. We can get additional detail in individual meetings.
Something that I appreciate that. Before we move on, though, I'd like to maybe for us to also start thinking about, a handful of potential partners. Maybe by the next meeting that we have, and obviously trying to gain their support, maybe through a letter, asking them, or letting them know what we're trying to do here. And if they're willing to sign on so that we can lean on them, so we can grow our sphere, if you will, as we embark on this new committee in which ultimately AQMD can't do it all. And we're going to need the support of these other entities. So just a thought here as we try to dwindle, if you will, or bring in maybe a few areas that eventually I think we need to really think about where we want to go with this. Because obviously there's a lot of great ideas, and it may be the faith community would be one aspect, specifically that, and it may be technology and specifically that, and then we got those two as priorities, and then eventually we should maybe start thinking about who can be invited to this table and write those letters of support so that they can partner with us and ensuring that ultimately they're getting the same information, education that we're getting so that we can improve upon the air quality issues that we face in our community. So just want us to consider that, although I know that right now it's up in the air as to where specifically, we are going to really hone in on, because there's a lot. And so with that, if there's no one else to speak on this matter, maybe we move on to the second item.
Yes, we will.
Good morning, Chair Perez and members of the committee. My name is Sarah Reese. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer for Planning, Rule Development and Implementation here at the district. And today I'm going to lean on my prior background as a policy analyst in climate change for Governor Inslee and give a quick overview of what happened at the Conference of Parties, or COP29 meeting that just concluded in Baku, Azerbaijan. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the items that I'm going to cover. I'm going to give some orientation of what COP is and how that ties into the UN Treaty on Climate Change, go through some of the key items that were discussed at that meeting, review the decisions that were made, and then give a little tiny preview of what we think we're going to see at the COP30 meeting, which will be happening in November of next year in Brazil. Next slide, please. Just a way of background, I've covered this material before in a prior climate change committee meeting, but I think it's helpful just for context. So the UN Treaty on Climate Change is called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. Like all air quality things, many acronyms are used, so climate change is no different. This is a big treaty that it has been in effect since March of 1994. The U.S. was one of the original signatories to this. Our participation as the U.S. is being led by Department of State as an international treaty. The members are all different countries, so it's very much at the country national level. And the overarching goal of this treaty is twofold. It's one, it's to stabilize global climate concentrations at a level to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, and then also within a sufficient timeline to assure that we're able to minimize the effects, adapt to changes as they do happen, and not threaten sustainability or other issues. Next slide, please. Just to simply, the approach of the UN treaty is recognizing the role that developed countries have played in this. As a developed nation, we've benefited greatly from industrialization. Other countries have not been so fortunate to do that. And industrialization really was the driver for all of the greenhouse gas emissions and the climate change that we're now experiencing. And so the concept here is that developed countries lead the way. They lead the way by taking aggressive steps to cut emissions, by raising funds and talking about climate financing to assist developing countries and what they need to do, and then also report back on actions that are taken so that there's some accountability of, how have you cut your emissions, what steps you're taking, what are you going to do in the future. For the last 9 years, the focus really has been about some of the agreements that came out of the Paris COP that happened in 2015. At that meeting, there was an agreement to take steps to hold global warming to within 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrialized levels, with the hope that they could try to limit it to within 1.5 degrees Celsius. I will say that we're getting really close, if not getting close to surpassing that 1.5 already. So things are still going up. Next slide, please. Okay. So you hear about this COP meeting. What is this meeting? And it's really just the annual meeting of the members of the UN Treaty on Climate Change. It's called the Conference of Parties. This is the decision-making body of this UN treaty. And so they get together pretty much every year to talk about key issues and make decisions on what they're going to do moving forward. There's currently just under 200 signatories to this treaty. And COP29, again, it was held most recently in November of this past year in Azerbaijan. Next slide. All right, so key issues that were discussed, COPs in general, they're pretty big. It's a little bit of a circus, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on and many topics that are up for discussion and negotiation. But I'm going to point to three key areas if I had to just pick the what I consider the most important ones. A big focus at this meeting was on finance. Climate finance is an important topic because it's going to take a lot of money to transition to lower emitting technologies, also to adapt. Carbon markets was another issue. And then also a new round of national climate plans were being developed. Next slide, please. Okay. For climate finance goals, I mentioned the importance of raising money. This is something that has been noted and recognized by COP or these meetings in the past. Back in 2009, that's when the first climate financing goals were established. This particular COP, COP29, really was billed as the finance COP because that's when they wanted to roll up their sleeves and recommit to what new climate financing goals would be developed and met. Again, in keeping with the overall themes for the UN Climate Change Committee, the focus really is on developed countries to raise these funds and to be able to provide this financing. The previous finance goals for developed countries was to raise $100 billion per year between the years 2020 and 2025. That goal was met in 2022, so it seems that that's on track. But we recognize that there's a lot more need. $100 billion sounds like a lot, but when you consider what is actually needed to get to, all of the things that need to be covered, there's a lot more need. And so the current estimates to transition developing countries, $1 trillion a year by 2030, $1.3 trillion a year by 2035. So it's a pretty big gap in there. Next slide, please. Kind of the key financing issues that were being discussed was, one, again, how to generate the funds. I mentioned that developed countries are really to lead the way, and the onus really is on those folks to provide the funding needed. Right now, 24 states from OECD are responsible for generating the funding. The U.S. is one of them. The U.S. has been a major contributor in the past. Last year, we contributed about just shy of $10 billion for global climate funding. It's a little unclear if that's going to continue with the current administration or the next administration. The current administration boosted that climate funding fairly substantially. There's also a question of what role developing countries should play, because under the treaty, under the climate change treaty, what was classified as a developing country might not necessarily be developing anymore. And so an example is China. China is classified as a developing country. China actually has, in the scheme of things, a fairly robust economy. And in fact, China has been voluntarily contributing to global climate funding to the tune of about $4 billion a year recently, which is actually close to what the US had been contributing up until last year. Next slide, please. All right, so some of the key climate finance decisions that came out of COP29. The first was establishing a new climate financing goal of $300 billion a year to be raised between the years 2030 and 2035. After much animated discussion, they agreed that they were just going to let developing countries contribute voluntarily and not have a further analysis or inquiry if some of those developing countries had more ability to contribute. They recognize that there's still a shortfall. $300 billion a year sounds great, but if the need is $1 trillion a year, there's a bit of a gap. And so committing to launch what they call the Baku to Belém roadmap. So between now and the next COP, figuring out what they're going to do to try to make up for that financial shortfall. And then there's a progress report that is due in 2028. Next slide, please. All right, the next topic I'm going to talk about is international carbon markets. And when I talk about a carbon market, you're familiar with California's cap and trade program. That's one form of a carbon market. Probably the biggest one in the world is in Europe with the EU emission trading scheme. I think we're a little familiar with how these cap and trade systems work. Back in COP21, which was the Paris COP in 2015, they developed the requirements to develop international carbon markets. And the idea here is that countries that are signatories to COP, if they fall short of their emission reductions that they're committed to, they could trade with another country that perhaps is, overachieved on their emission reduction targets. Carbon markets are pretty complicated. There's a lot of details that have to be worked out to make sure that they're actually going to get the emission reductions that they're intended to do. You have to make sure you have mechanisms in place so you're not double counting, mechanisms in place to make sure emission reductions that come out of there are actually on top of what otherwise would have happened. So there's a lot of, the devil is definitely in the details. In COP29, they established some pretty broad guidelines that kind of allows countries to take preliminary steps towards international trading, but there's a lot of details that really need to be worked out, and that's been deferred to the next COP that will happen in Brazil next year. Next slide, please. And then another issue that was grappled with was the new round of national climate plans. They're called, under the UN Climate Treaty, they call these nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And it's nothing more than a climate plan. It's just where a country commits to how many emission reductions they're going to take, by when, by date certain, and then other types of, if there's financing, if they're a developed country, what kind of financing they're going to issue, and then if there's other goals like steps towards adaptation, et cetera. All of the signatories already have had climate plans in place. Current projections estimate that global climate emissions must be, or carbon emissions must be cut from 60% by 2035 from 2019 levels, which is a pretty big additional step. So in light of that, the signatories are all required to come up with a new round of climate plans that reflect that need. And so this is the third round of the climate plans. These are all due in 2025, specifically February of 2025. And these are required to set emission reduction targets for that 2035 timeline, as well as strengthen their current targets they have for 2030. Next slide, please. Some countries have been overachievers and have already released their new climate plans. So the UK, for example, United Arab Emirates, and also Brazil. You can see from these numbers here, they do have targets of additional emission reductions they will achieve by 2035, but they have different baseline years. So for example, the UK is looking at an 81% emission reduction, which sounds fantastic, but it's from 1990 levels. So it's a very, very big timeline. UAE, they are actually looking at what was established for COP. So they're 47% from 2019 to 2035. But again, what the projection is, you have to cut 60% in that time frame. So it's a little under that. And then Brazil, their baseline is compared to 2005 levels. More of these plans are going to be announced throughout 2025. Again, the technical dates by which these are due are February of 2025. I expect that a lot of countries won't hit that, and we'll just see these trickling out, probably a bunch more of them trickling out closer we get to the next COP meeting. Next slide, please. So what I've talked about so far is the UN Climate Treaty, COP. Those are all things that happen at national level. So countries are signatories to these UN treaties. But there's a substantial role that states and entities that are smaller than nations can contribute. We call these the subnational states. And subnational states, again, can play a very big role because they're more local in nature, kind of closer to some of the work that's been going on, definitely witnessing the impacts of climate change. Probably the strongest coalition of subnational states is called the Under 2 Coalition. This is a coalition that was formed by the state of California and the state of Baden-Württemberg in 2015, so at the Paris COP. And this is really just a platform for these subnational entities to get together, to exchange information, to support the work that's happening at COP. Just under 180 states and regions worldwide that are members, and that all of the members that are part of this, they commit to be net zero by 2050, and then also to take additional action both on adaptation and on climate finance. Next slide, please. The Under 2 Coalition gets together every year, and these meetings, it's a meeting of their General Assembly. They hold these parallel to COP. So they typically will have them, at the same venue where COP is being held. And this is really the showcase of knowledge and local climate action, where they can all exchange information, what's going on. Sometimes they will agree to take specific steps. The focus areas that this General Assembly had for COP29, encouraging countries to be more aggressive in developing their next round of climate plans, supporting whatever goals come out of COP for financing, as well as focusing on methane emissions and additional steps that need to be taken to reduce those. Next slide, please. Okay, so was COP29 a success? There were agreements reached on some of the key goals that they had going into this, so that's always good when you have these international meetings. But I think there was a lot of disappointment on climate financing. The $300 billion a year goal was well shy of what is projected to be needed. The thought is just to adapt to a changing climate, you need something like $200 to $300 billion a year more. And so this was great disappointment, particularly from some of the developing countries that are already very, very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, like the island states that are pretty much getting wiped out through sea level rise right now. Very, very concerning. Also, within that goal of raising $300 billion per year, there weren't a lot of details on how you're going to get there and what those climate financing mechanisms look like. And so there's still a lot more work that needs to be done in this space. Again, more details are needed for those national climate plans and the governing principles for carbon markets. We hope that that will be flushed out more at the next COP meeting. And then there was supposed to have been discussions on global goals for adaptation at COP29. Those got derailed pretty early in the process, and so was, again, kicked down the road for the next COP. And then finally, there was a lot of divisive rhetoric from the host country. When you host a COP meeting, part of what the host country is supposed to really do is be diplomatic, is be encouraging of developing the goals, be a supportive role. France played a very, very strong role at the Paris COP, for example, in shepherding and making sure that agreements were reached. And kind of the opposite happened in Azerbaijan, where the host country had some rhetoric that was so divisive that some countries actually took their delegations and left. So hopefully we have something better next year. Okay, well, speaking of which, next slide, please. Key issues for the next COP. Again, it's going to be held in Brazil in a town called Belém. It's the kind of the headwaters of the Amazon. So in that place, it's going to be highlighting the importance of nature-based climate solutions. The big focus here will be on adaptation measures. And they still have a lot of work they need to do to flush out those details on climate financing needs, as well as on those carbon markets. I would expect at this point, with all of the countries needing to provide new climate plans, that'll be a big focus of discussion and figuring out how that all works together. So with that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Before I ask my colleagues, just very quickly, what's our role there? What has been our role in the past? Have we had one? To what degree? Do we engage in these talks that take place?
We have not engaged, our agency has not engaged in COP in the past. Some other entities in California, so the state of California does engage. There's usually a delegation from Cal EPA, as well as the chair of CARB has attended, but we have not attended.
So we've never been to the COP conference itself, or we just have not attended those discussions?
Both.
Huh. Okay, so this last year was an attempt to go, but we decided not to go.
Correct.
Okay. And so this next COP conference, we're having this discussion, obviously, but are we now thinking of going? Is that the point? And if so, are we going to, how do we integrate ourselves into making sure that we have a voice at the table?
Yeah, so again, we're a regional entity, so we're actually, we're not even a subnational, but kind of a subnational, right? And so at the negotiating table, that's really for the member nations, the folks that are signatories to that UN climate treaty. But there is a role that subnational entities can play in terms of having what we call side events, where you have discussions of perhaps share stories of how your region has been impacted by climate change, share stories of what you're doing about it and what steps you're taking, and just, have that coalition building. And so that's typically where California plays, because California doesn't have a seat at the table either. They're not a nation state. But that's typically where California and other state and local agencies will interact.
Okay, so is it possible then, if we're thinking about attending this conference, obviously not for the sake of just showing up, I would like to think about how we could identify some entities out there, maybe working with other groups here within the state of California, to have these type of learning exploratory discussions, right, where we share information and knowledge and what they've done, experiences in comparison to what we've done, and what seems to be working and what's not. I know that might be quite a bit to consider, but just would like for us to maybe think about having some sort of role to that degree, in which we do start forming some sort of collaborative partnership with entities throughout the world, if they're going to be coming to this conference as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. So there's a couple of ways in which one can attend COP. COP is open to members of the public, or at least there's zones of COP that all members of the public can attend. But then you can also get on a delegation, and an officially sponsored delegation to the UN. I think if we were to go to COP, we would work with a group called the Climate Registry, and have some sponsorship with them, which would then allow us to get on the delegation that they run. And that's typically where, at least where subnational entities have participated in the past. And so then working with the Climate Registry, we can discuss whether we would do one of these side events that I mentioned, or some other platform where we're able to actually share our stories, share the work that we're doing, as well as learn from others what they're doing who are in similar situations.
Yeah, I'd like for us to consider that, and as well, as we're moving forward and we're thinking about our own conference, how do we engage these entities to maybe one day come to Southern California, as we are beginning to grow, our alliances and our efforts within AQMD, being the entity that we are for the nation, and as well even internationally for that matter. How do we potentially engage individuals or groups to come to speak in the future at our conference? So I think that there's a way we can try to form this as we're trying to grow this committee, and quite frankly, the efforts of AQMD. So with that, I'd just like to open up to my colleagues. I don't see any on the at the dais anymore, but is there anybody that'd like to speak? There is Mr. Caccioli. Mr. Caccioli, how about yourself? Any thoughts on your end?
No, Manny, I'm just listening to your leadership. I'm fine.
Okay. Anybody else?
So Supervisor, you raised the issue about funding.
Yeah.
You're describing a very comprehensive program, and staffing levels will need to be discussed, and budgeting will need to be discussed. And then all the existing current workload issues we'll have to look at. And maybe that's something that we include within the budget, but we'll have to have further discussions on advancing that. And then I think as to the concepts that you've described, as Sarah said, we can work with the Climate Registry. That generally involves a fairly significant sponsorship level. There are other opportunities as well that Sarah and I have talked about. One including even C40, where the cities work together, and we'll reach out and contact cities. Mayor Garcetti was the recent chair when he was in the position, and I think Mayor Hidalgo from Paris was also a previous chair. So we'll look into some of those options as well. But it is an extensive amount of work. I just want to recognize that Sarah and her team have a pretty big plate right now.
Oh, Sarah can't do it all. I thought she could do it all. I thought she was superwoman.
We keep thinking that she can.
No, I get it. I understand 100%. And honestly, I think it is important that we, like I said, we got to start small, right? Start where we can and put a budget to it in hopes of going to identify resources to help pay for wherever we start. But it does sound to me here that we may potentially be going to this conference. And if we do go, I'd like for us to at least try to tackle one item or think about how we could maybe even try to schedule a conversation with an entity that we see a fit. It could be as close as Tijuana or, somewhere in Mexico City, that might happen to be there at this conference because obviously there are neighbors and that might be easier, but I just want to make sure that we're just, we're there to engage one way or another. Whatever that looks like, I'm not sure yet.
Supervisor and Wayne, maybe as we try to wrap our hands around trying to incorporate these great ideas and with their limited resources, maybe as I'm hearing Manny speak and Wayne, as we have these environmental justice conferences every year, maybe somehow we roll this together. Instead of doing separate ones, Manny, I was just at USC, we did a great conference. But this could be something where environmental justice is, rolled into it because it's the same issues. But you really, and we've got the legislative, public affairs, media, but maybe start incorporating some of this in because we can't do separate budgets with separate resources and staff, but it's an important item, Super, and I'm behind you. I'm just trying to figure out how to wrap it in with our limited resources.
Sure. Well, I figure we're talking about COP for a reason. I mean, what's the purpose behind this discussion, Wayne, if I may ask? So that we just kind of know what's going on at that level, or are we thinking about attending?
Well, we had discussed participating at the most recent COP in Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
And there were a number of concerns, conditions in the Middle East, host country concerns. And so we ultimately bowed out.
Right.
Thinking was that we would then look at the next one, which is in Brazil. There are going to be challenges. This is going to be in the rainforest. It's a very remote location. But we're looking into that as well and trying to get a better understanding of exactly what that entails, what the sponsorship costs would be with Climate Registry, travel, when would be the best way to go. And then, as you're saying, what is the message that we want to participate in? What is the ultimate benefit? And I think, as you noted, working with perhaps it's C40, where we can look at the air quality and the climate as being very integrated in a way that addresses both of our concerns, both from a climate and air quality. Because I think what we really want to do is we want to maximize on the co-benefit aspect of addressing climate, where we get those air quality benefits. And so identifying those cities that are most akin to the challenges that we face. As you know, Supervisor, Mexico City had terrible air quality decades ago. They've improved, but if we look at Mexicali, if we look at Tijuana, they still have tremendous air quality challenges.
Terrible.
Yes, so there is an opportunity to look at the climate aspects. And so your suggestion about maybe we look a little bit closer to home, maybe that's something that we focus on this first year, but we want to be able to look at it holistically in the way that you're saying. I think given the scope and comments that we've heard today, we may have to start a little bit smaller. But even that is a significant effort. So I just want to make sure that we understand the breadth and scope that we're talking about, because there are things that we can do perhaps very closely within our community, maybe a little bit further near our southern border, and then perhaps even much larger on the international stage. But we need to come back with that plan, and I think the key element of that is making sure that we have the appropriate venue to discuss and to learn and to educate.
Right. I mean, I hear like, for example, in Tijuana alone, there's 1,200 maquiladoras.
Yep.
Meaning manufacturing plants and growing. You know how many trucks that is?
Yeah.
Warehouses.
Yep.
You know, and how much that's impacting the air. So I do wonder, and I remember working on a piece of legislation back in the day regarding some, plants on that end of the border, on that side of the border, and trying to make an effort where they use some sort of bat type of technologies. Can't remember the entire bill anymore, but at the end of the day, we passed something that dealt with some form of understanding of the fact that they need to reduce their emission production out there and improve air quality because of the amount of maquiladoras that exist. I wonder what that looks like now. I mean, that may even be like a weekend field trip, if you will, where we go visit some of these spaces and figure out what's going on and what are they doing to improve, if that's the case, and if they're so willing or not. I know that's international once again, but it's just thinking out loud. I mean, that's, while we're over here trying to improve our air quality, that's just down the street.
Right.
That air pollution is not stopping at the border. So,
Well, one of the things, Supervisor, that we might want to do, EPA and Mexico used to have a program that was focused on 100 kilometers on either side of the border and identified priorities. We can reach out to EPA and ask them what the latest border plan is, because dealing with the maquiladores, dealing with the trucks that come across from Mexico at the port of entry, all of those are things that I think would be worthwhile for us to hear about as you're identifying. But we'll reach out to EPA and see if we can get an update. I know EPA has the border office in San Diego, and we'll find out and be able to provide some further information at the next
for
meeting.
sure. Well, while we're on the subject, and maybe if possible, as I mentioned earlier, for our next meeting, if we could have some sort of presentation on an individual that can provide us some sort of background on air pollution and the border. And, they may have expertise that we can learn from, and trying to better understand that part of the puzzle. And potentially understand what technologies are being used or what have you. But that might be something that we could use in our next, put that in our next agenda.
We'll do what we can.
All right.
Supervisor, just a quick comment if possible.
Yeah.
Thanks, man. As you're talking about this, I'm just, as you talked about interagency and Wayne, how it's all integrated or interconnected. I was at a water agency meeting the other night, inducting one of my fellow constituents who's a board member, Upper San Gabriel Valley Municipal Water District, a couple million people, agencies, same people, constituents we represent. They get their water from Metropolitan, who's a wholesaler and represents pretty much a similar down here. It's just, they're fighting. I mean, the whole discussion, I stayed for the whole meeting. It was pretty interesting talking about how they're moving water that we drink or use to bathe. very little in our basin. It's all imported Colorado up north, State Water Project. But they're fighting these more frequent, not severe, but droughts. So they've got the same concerns we've got, Manny. And so we're looking at partners, and sometimes they don't even see it, or the public doesn't see it. But the whole discussion, well, if there's a couple more drought years and we're not sure what's going to happen, but it's all interconnected to climate. So I don't know how we pull these other resources together to work with them. And it's like you said, it's almost overwhelming how big this can get or small can get. But I just see so many connections between both. They're in air silo doing their thing with water, we're in our air, but we're really connected on this climate change. It brings us together. So I don't know what you want to do with that, but there's a big resource right there.
Sure. All right, well, I think we've whet the appetite quite a bit today. Don't lose sleep over it, folks, but obviously it is something that we need to consistently consider. All right, any other points on this subject? Are there any are there any public comments on this subject at all, or any outside entities calling in at all, Wayne?
There's no hands raised. I don't know if people are aware that they can raise their hand for public comment. Now that I've said it, nobody's raised their hand yet. And still no hand raised, so I think it's safe to say that we've asked for public comment.
All right, Grace. So there's no other business at hand.
As soon as I said that, 2 hands went up, Supervisor.
All right, that's fine. So no other business at hand. Let's move through that. And unless there is other business.
Do you wanna-
Well, I think we do need to have general public comment within any matter within the committee's jurisdiction that is not on the agenda today. But also, are we going to recognize the hands that went up, right? As Wayne said, there were no hands.
Yes, I was going to recognize them at the end, but
Yes, thank you.
yeah, I was going to recognize them now, as a matter of fact. So go ahead. Who's first, Wayne?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Nastry has informed me that one of the hands that was raised is Supervisor Hagman, who is a member of this committee but not participating from a noticed location. Therefore, he may not make a comment to the committee. He only participates as an observer.
So he can't make a comment as a constituent?
No, it does not say as a member of the public. It says as observer. The AG has made clear that does not include making comment.
All right, Kurt, sorry. And I see Harvey Eder.
Hello, am I being heard?
Yes, you are, sir.
Okay, well, I nodded out for the last 15, 20 minutes, and I'm not sure what the item was. I know that they were talking about, mission statement, purpose and goals, and then about COP29. So, if I talk on those, am I covering something, or should
I think you are. You would be covering.
Okay. On COP29, that was following 28. Okay, let's get a perspective. 28 was over in the Middle East. Okay, it was the Arabs and the oil companies. Okay, they did not want to phase out fossil fuels. Okay, they wanted to keep on using them. There's a new podcast called The Great Simplification. A guy was a trader on Wall Street, and he felt guilty or whatnot, wasn't getting laid, and decided to do energy, environment, and economics, and got a doctorate. And a bunch of the podcasts on there, one I brought up before was a Sir David King. He's professor emeritus at Cambridge in physical chemistry. And that the numbers that were used for greenhouse gases that Reese brought up are wrong. They use 20 to 30 global warming potential. He said the number is at least 120. Now that's times two, because the numbers are, it's 2 millions versus billions, okay? So the numbers we gave, and this is what the Solar New Deal was based on, the 16 plan, which has been totally ignored, and that you guys are calling zero. This has all been done by the federal government. It was outrageous. It was not even, we put in 100 exhibits, the Solar New Deal. You purged the meeting February 8th of 19 of the administrative committee when I discussed this with Dr. Burke. Wayne quipped up, we addressed his concerns, and we put in the thumb drive that had the 100 exhibits on it, and it was no due process at this agency. And there were no meetings on climate for 15 damn years, okay? This was 10 years ago, all right? We brought up in the 7th, et cetera. We litigated in 92 and brought up climate in state courts, and we cited RICO, and that is still in the federal file and will be acted upon. And we included in there is the senior thesis that I did in environmental studies and turned in 1981 as a consultant to the PUC, the first black commissioner, Commissioner Grimes, whose family ran the 54th, that the movie Glories are about, and was.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Editor. Your comments. Your 3 minutes are up. Is there any other comment on the line here?
No, there's not.
Okay. All right. Well, it seems like we got through the agenda, and it's now 12:49 and counting. And if there's nothing else to speak on, our next meeting date will be to be determined.
Mr. Eder has put his hand up, Mr. Chair.
Yes, but didn't he just make his comment now?
Well, there may be some confusion here. I thought his last comment was regarding the 2 agenda items, and so that this would now be allowable as comment on matters within the committee's jurisdiction, but not on the agenda. So that was my interpretation. He would be able to speak again.
That's fine. Hey, Arvin, put him back on.
Hello, thank you. I'm being heard.
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
You're back on, Harvey.
Thanks. Okay. My name's Harvey Eder. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition and like-minded folks and individuals. I was just referring to a study I did as a consultant to the PUC on the first proceedings they had. It was called OII 42. It was on $180 million solar hot water demonstration. Okay. They earmarked 10%, the first time ever, for low income because they were taxing through the rate base. And they hired me the PSPC, as a consultant on this. Okay, so we produced the Low Income Solar Equity Program. It was to coordinate this and other programs for the PUC, and the tax credits were all new. We worked with the people, the first people we developed the solar tax credits here in the state, 40, 45 years, 50 years ago, all right? So it was never evaluated. Y'all never evaluated it. The PUC never evaluated it. CARB never evaluated EP. So that's got to be done. That's basic thing. And it was leveraging and coordinating, vertically and horizontally integrating, based on what the oil industry had did. We had a class in '74 at UC on the political economics of the oil industry. And I'm incorporating that by reference to syllabus. Dr. Claudia Carr works in East Africa, Somalia, etc., lived with the Maasai in Kenya. Anyway, she was very early. She started a women's studies program at UC. She's at Berkeley now doing energy and resources. Okay, now equity. All this stuff, the 300 million, the 1 trillion a year, that's equity, and that's got to be put into every contract that's done at every level. But it's got to be done based on Piketty 2014 and 2020, capitalism in the 20th century, and capitalism and ideology. That in the last 40, 50 years, there's been no increase in income and equity for 2/3 of the country. Our democracy's threatened, everything's threatened. We see Trump coming in. We've got to stand up against that. We've got to educate people through climate They see all this stuff happening with the weather, and it's accelerating it. They got to have a reason, scientific explanation and education. We were the public. We were the solar education professionals in 77 and 78 for Santa Cruz County. Now that should be done here at every county and in cities and coordinated in the district and around the country. All right. Also, we beat out a woman that just graduated from Stanford, whose father was a Nobel laureate in physics, and ripped off a grad student for invention of the laser that lost a lawsuit $20 million later. $20 million in litigation over the control of the notes for his patent. Charles Towns, he was Columbia. Okay, enough's enough. So education and what we did at the local level, and now public power. We brought in the.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Eder, for your comments. Your 3 minutes are up. And I believe now we're towards the end of the meeting. Next meeting days to be determined, if that's correct.
Yes.
And until then, this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye, meeting.
Thank you.
Okay.